I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
This is part 5 in our series Not Made in China. And we're going to do, the last couple we've mostly done a single work. This is going to be an author in general.
Yeah.
The great San Mao.
Sun Mao. So Sun Mao has started to actually receive some recognition in the West
Finally.
recently. In 2019, she was one of the female authors who was highlighted by the New York Times as someone they should have done, a woman that they should have done an obituary on, but didn't at the time of her death. She was born in 1943 in Chongqing. I think her family was involved with KMT politics, which meant that she was born in the wartime capital there of China. They fled China in 1949 as the communists advanced. And she grew up in Taiwan as like a fairly elite Taiwanese woman. But what's fascinating about her is that she, at a time when most people in Taiwan could not leave Taiwan, she left Taiwan and traveled a ton.
So, one of the things that's been pointed out about her career, and I think it's absolutely crucial, is that there are other 20th century writers of romantic fiction or fiction that just feels sort of romantic in the general 19th century sense, like wandering the globe sort of thing. But very few of them actually lived that life, and San Mao did live that life. Her life is a romance. If you made a movie out of it, people would go, I don't know if I'm buying this.
And when I read San Mao, which San Mao is not her real name is Chen Maoping. San Mao actually did have an incredible life, but when I read her fiction, I'm always wondering how much she's kind of pulling the wool over my eyes. She has this incredible story. She leaves Taiwan at a time when most people couldn't leave Taiwan. She's this very empowered female figure at a time when feminism is not really there in Taiwan. She marries a Spanish guy, Jose
Ruiz.
And, they move to the Saharan desert, and he
Western
works
Sahara, yeah.
in like resource extraction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really when she becomes famous, I think in 1974, right, Rob?
Yeah, right. 1974. She publishes Restaurant in the Desert.
Right, which is a short story that becomes a part of a larger work, the Sahala de Gusha.
Stories of the Sahara.
Yeah, so that story is published in a newspaper, and then it catches on, and she becomes one of the most famous authors in Taiwan, most popular author, I should say. She's largely ignored in academia.
For the same reason that for a very long time, Zhang Ailing was ignored. Because romance figures strongly in her works, even if it's not necessarily the sort of Harlequin romance thing. But there's always an element, like you said, of sort of, how would I put this? Not over-dramatizing something, but there's supernatural elements. There's parts of her fiction that make you go, hang on, did she really do that?
It's overwrought.
It's
right?
overwrought. But part of it is, the fascination with her and her fiction is that she did live a fascinating life and lived in the Western Sahara at a time when it was Spanish controlled, but was moving away from that, right? The Sahrawi rebels were fighting against the Spanish, and she had friends who were in the revolutionary group, right? I mean, can you imagine? If you made a movie about someone from a fairly repressed background who married a Spanish husband and moved to the Western Sahara and participated in a revolution, you'd be like, yeah.
Imagine if North Dakota was a country.
Wow, did you just compare North Dakota to Taiwan?
I did. In terms of like.
My apologies to those who are from North Dakota.
And I love North Dakota. I think Teddy Roosevelt National Park is one of the most underrated national parks in the country. But that said, no one would give North Dakota like top exciting awards in terms of, like exciting places in America and like places where where lots of people come to live. That's, one of the things about North Dakota.
Right.
But it's this rural backwater. And Taiwan is a very much at the time she's writing it's a rural backwater, and I think it's it's just as flabbergasting for a Taiwanese woman to go on these journeys and then write home. And one of the things that I'm always struck by is women in their 50s and 60s who I meet in Taiwan, they always, like, hands down, always tell me San Mao is one of their favorite, if not their top writer. And I get that from so many different people in Taiwan. And San Mao was also, after the opening up in the 1980s, San Mao was also famous in China too.
And it's not hard to imagine why, like we just said. Now, as you say, she hasn't been taken particularly seriously. You know, there are periodicals, like you just mentioned, that are only sort of now coming around to, oh, she was actually really good, you know?
So can I push back against that?
Please do.
So you compared her to Zhang Ailing in some ways. So I've read I've read a bit of San Mao. Do you actually think
Stylistically, no. I wouldn't say
Okay.
that there's similar writers in the way that
or
they write.
can I just ask you, do you think San Mao is good as a writer? Like
Okay.
Zhang Ailing, we both, I think, agree is one of the best writers in the
Absolutely.
20th century.
Sure.
Certainly in the Chinese tradition, I think she competes with Lu Xun, and we can go back and forth over who is the best writer of the Chinese 20th century.
Right.
San Mao?
No, definitely not. But she's more interesting than stylistically daring or deeply moving. I wish I could compare her to an analog in the 20th century.
She's a travel writer, right?
She's
Like,
a travel writer and
of
she's a very good travel
think
writer.
of like Frances Mays, maybe.
Yeah, or even now I was about to say some of Orwell's nonfiction travel stuff, but he's a better writer. Anyway, the point simply being that there is, like you say, the when she was cited later as, hey, we should have done this obituary earlier. It was for a woman writer who died, and that's always the preface, right? I would say one of the things that sets Zhang Ailing apart is I don't really care.
She's not a woman writer.
What,
She's
what
just
category
you know,
you put
like,
her in?
you
She's
don't
a freaking amazing
you
author.
don't put her. You don't have to categorize Zhang Ailing.
But
Whereas
if-
San Mao, you
If
do
San
have
Mao
to,
was a man, her collection would be a little
Less
different.
impressive.
Like you'd be like, okay, well, whatever. Because a lot of Chinese intellectuals and scholars had already traveled a lot. Now, to be fair, the Western Sahara in the 70s is a little different than,
It's
say,
very-
Cambridge or
it's very far
Harvard.
out, even
Yeah.
for male Taiwanese writer.
And I should also point out, because we haven't really talked about the content of some of these. They are travel writing, but what's interesting, and I would continue to argue important about them, is that she's not just saying, wow, this place is really cool. She's bringing in elements of Chinese culture as well. Like the restaurant in the desert is basically an account of her cooking Chinese food for these people.
Yeah, and she gets this order of like all of these Chinese ingredients
Right.
from her family as like a giant care package, and so she cooks them up, and it's essentially just not locals, because a lot of it's just the like workers from Europe who are her husband's buddies, their reaction to eating Chinese food for the first time, and it's done in this like desert wilderness
Right.
on the edge of civilization.
Which I should point out is always a popular trope. It does not matter the culture. The restaurant at the end of the world idea is always going to work, right? For Douglas Adams. But is San Mao the Douglas Adams? No. No, she's
Do you know
not.
the correct answer to that, Rob?
What? Tell me.
42.
42, right. Thank you. Oh, I hope you're all as big a nerds as we are. Anyway, but she continues to bring this up, and in fact, this is a theme throughout her fiction, is elements of, sometimes very traditional elements of Chinese culture, traditional medicine. She often portrays herself as a kind of ambassador of goodwill, bringing Chinese healing and food and all these things to the world, to Europe as well as to the Western Sahara. She does go back to Taiwan after her husband dies. They were married 6 years, I believe, 7
Something
years.
like
He
that.
died in a diving accident.
Typical for San Mao's
Right.
biography.
I mean, yeah, he wouldn't have died,
I think
in
he
a
was
car accident.
I think
or
he was
something.
doing some underwater fire juggling or something.
Or something, yeah, like chasing down rebels in scuba gear, and that would make sense. But again, back to this point, there is also a trope in Chinese literature of the wanderer, and those figures tend to be extremely popular because you just don't. I think of the
You don't have them that much, or
well,
you don't.
you don't have that. You don't have the ability to wander, really. And again, you could make this case for most cultures. But
So can I ask you, do
Yeah.
you think Sun Mao is kind of a modern day Shioji, Journey to the West kind of figure?
fewer monkeys in her fiction, especially magical ones. But that's an interesting reference, right? Because what makes that series is the picaresque quality. They're going to lands unknown. That's always really
And
interesting.
that's really the only that's the most interesting
Right.
part of San Mao's fiction. And I think that's why those 50-year-old, 60-year-old Taiwanese women who I meet are so in love with her writing, is because she has this kind of picaresque quality where she's just traveling somewhere interesting and observing it. There's not like in the restaurant in the desert, there's no plot. It's just observation, which
Right.
is fascinating for its own reasons. But I think for us as a coming 50 years after she's writing this, really, it's more of an artifact rather than a literary work for us.
Yes, and it's also more universal than a lot of other work, bodies of work in the 20th century, for the simple reason that she's doing this, not because, I'm thinking about the May 4th writers. A lot of them studied abroad. Very few of those writings have caught on. Why? Well, how romantic is it really to go to a university somewhere else, right? You have to get into university in the first place. It's just a rarefied world. This is not. This is anybody could travel. This is somebody marrying the right person at the right time and getting out of there.
I have to disagree with you, Rob. I think that
There's a shocker.
one of the things that makes this so interesting is that there really were limits, both in terms of legal limits and also financial limits, on Taiwanese folks' ability to travel abroad. There's a series of stories by Bai Xianyong called Taipei Ren, or just Taipei people, and one of the stories that I've read and is just called Winter Nights, and it's about someone who's coming back from studying abroad and being a professor abroad. And so there were people who were leaving Taiwan at the time, but almost no one was leaving Taiwan to just travel. It was always like connected to study abroad or very clear business.
Right, but my point wasn't though that it's a universal experience. Like anyone can go do it. I mean, I mentioned anyone could go do it. What I should have said wasn't that anyone could go do it, but that the avenue she took was through a world that, like you say, legally everyone was under. Like you couldn't travel, right? But B, she got married. Everyone gets married. Everyone can identify with that experience, right? She got married to someone interesting. Maybe fewer people, but if you're already married, you can easily imagine it, right? Not a lot of people can imagine studying, German philosophy in Cambridge. That's a tough sell, right? A romantic relationship with an interesting person that whisks you away to another world, even if you cannot possibly fathom actually doing that, the actual means for doing that are more accessible than going to an institution of higher learning in the UK.
I think what you're getting at is San Mao is less of an elitist.
Possibly, yes. It's a completely, not ridiculous, but it's a plot right out of a romance tale, right?
Yeah.
But there's a reason a lot of the vernacular stories from the Ming and the Qing remain so popular, and part of it is purely the fantastic aspect of this imaginary world. Wow, I'd never even imagined that before. But there's something very quotidian, very ordinary about them. I are huge Pu Songling fans, as everyone knows, but one of the most interesting things about Pu Songling is just how ordinary his people are, even when they're exam candidates and stuff. Ultimately, romances and things from the supernatural revolve around stuff like, hey, sure, it'd be great to settle down and have a stable family somewhere, which is what not everyone, but ideally everyone would want in that society. So when you can relate to something that everyone can imagine getting, even if they don't currently have it, I think it increases popularity.
Maybe, yeah.
So, now, you and I are both agree that San Mao is not our favorite writer, we bring her up in this series for a number of reasons. First, because she does get overlooked. Second, because although there are, we've already mentioned Malaysia, the U.S., even France, the number of works by Chinese people or even translated for Chinese people coming out of Africa are slim to none.
Yeah.
This is a part of the world, and yet, China's been deeply involved in Africa for well on 60 years now, possibly even longer. There have been writings coming out of there. I'll go ahead and I think he's in the process of changing his blog, but Bruce Humes has an entire blog dedicated to sort of transnational sort of Chinese literatures. And for a while, he had an entire section just dedicated to African literature being translated into Chinese. It's becoming a big thing, but that's just in the last, 15 years or something, right?
So Sun Mao is kind of ahead of the curve.
She's
in
blazing a trail. There was nobody writing this stuff. There was nobody writing this stuff as of 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So she's extremely important, not just for being this romantic figure, but for not just promoting Chinese culture globally either, but for promoting Western Saharan, Spanish, Arabic culture. I think she's Arabic-speaking culture.
I think she's more important for promoting a sort of globalization within Taiwan.
That's better put,
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But, a part of that is giving both sides their say.
Sure.
The Western Saharan peoples she encountered and the Spanish and the Taiwanese. They're all in the book here, right? They're all in the story. This isn't a piece of propaganda where the Chinese are just telling all the rest of the world how to live, or alternately are realizing that they're stupid or something and need to learn from the foreigners. They're both in dialogue, and it's not the best executed of that, but it's still a very important idea that I don't think I've seen very often.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to point out that Sun Mao is writing this at a time when Taiwanese literature is just really up and coming.
Yeah.
There had been some elements that something you could kind of call literature, but it was really more propaganda in the 50s and kind of on into the 60s. In the 70s, you're starting to see this bubbling up of real Taiwanese literature, and I mean real Taiwanese literature. Both it's focusing on Taiwan, but also it's just interesting to read. It's stuff that we today can still go back and kind of sort of enjoy. So I'm thinking particularly of Bai Xianyong, Huan Qingming, and other authors like that, Wang Zhenhe. All of them are sort of starting to get into their careers. And Sun Mao is kind of writing at that same time, but she takes a very different approach by focusing on the global.
Yeah.
And I think you're right, that was popular at the time because it sort of translated global culture into this Taiwanese context.
Right. And again, I don't think I've seen that even much the last couple of decades. You and I have done podcasts on a few other writers who've traveled abroad and written abroad, but it tends to be usually pretty negative, either because the people abroad are contemptible, or, like in Yu Dafu's Sinking, the author is contemptible, right?
The author and the society that surrounds him.
Right. So there's this. China spends a lot of the 20th century, or Chinese writers do spend a lot of the 20th century with a serious inferiority complex.
Yeah.
Lao She's Cat Country, for example, is scathing about where Chinese culture is at the time.
Lu Xun's preface to Nahan
right.
is the classic
Is the
example.
classic, but that continues for a long time, right? Yeah. One of the things that's utterly fascinating about China's global reach now is how far in the other direction they've gone. And we're kind of getting off topic, so I'll make this a final comment, and we'll circle back around to Sun Mao. But something like Wolf Warrior 2, for example, is bananas. But it's I've listened to a couple of reviews from people who've seen it. But if you've been involved in China a long time, it's not a surprise. It's just not. You're like, I could have seen this movie being made 20 years ago, right?
Wolf Warrior 2 is, of course, the blockbuster film.
The highest grossing film in Chinese history.
At that point, I think it's been surpassed.
Has it really? By what?
Yeah, I forget.
Anyway.
But anyways, it's essentially just this nationalistic garbage.
A Chinese special forces guy operating in Africa saves the African
Africans
people from the
American
rapacious
mercenaries.
Americans and all that.
Yeah,
Now, we could spend a long time talking about how many garbage American films were made like that in the 80s in particular. But anyway, the point simply being that this would not have existed in the early parts of the 20th century. China was way far the other direction. Most Chinese writers were writing about how much catch-up they had to do to reform Chinese literature, but to be modern and stuff. And so it's a marker of where we're at that it's gone this way. Now, to circle back to San Mao, the only reason I bring that up is that's a globalism in the sense that Wolf Warrior 2 is straight Hollywood action. I mean, 100% absolutely Michael Bay all the way kind of stuff, right? There still isn't, you have one extreme or the other. San Mao is saying, really, we could all just be in dialogue here and exchanging stories. We could do that, and food and all that. But a lot of writers are saying, nah, you're gonna have to kind of pick a side here. And so that's why I would still recommend giving her stuff a read, even if you don't spend a lot of time reading it, just to see an example of someone coming from a Chinese-speaking background who's really looking globally.
At a time when very few people, either in Taiwan or China, are able to leave those environments.
Right.
There is actually an English edition to her work. It's been published after her 1991 suicide. It is called just The Stories of the Sahara. That's the English translation. I think it's published by Bloomsbury. I don't know how good it is. We were looking.
Lee
at
and
the
I only
Chinese.
read the Chinese on this podcast. Actually, it's not true. We read translations quite a bit, but anyway.
But for this we haven't looked at the English translation. But I think that as a final wrapping up thought, I think that the listener, if they're interested in learning more about this, should definitely take a look at, and if they can get their hands on a copy of San Mao's Sahala de Gusha, or The Stories of the Sahara, for understanding. Again, like I said earlier in the podcast, it's more of an artifact. It's more about understanding where Taiwan was at that time to make this one of the most popular writers in Taiwan in the 1970s.
And 80s,
And she went on to make a career just out of travel writing because of her popularity. She was able to do that.
A time capsule. Definitely check it out, especially if you don't know anything about Taiwan or Taiwanese literature. This is a really interesting introduction to all of that.
Yeah.
I'll just say also here real quick as we're wrapping up, write us a review on iTunes if you've enjoyed this, and check us out at Twitter, Chinese Lit Pod. You can find out what's coming up. And then, of course, we're at Chinese Literature Podcast at gmail.com, and then ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com for the website. We got some big stuff coming up. Certainly a brand new series coming up in the new year in January that we'll be promoting shortly. And it is going to be a doozy.
Oh, man.
It is.
I love doozies.
I know you do.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.